When I was in middle school, one afternoon I went over with a friend to play basketball on our neighbor's driveway using their basketball hoop. We went over without asking permission. We had a basketball hoop on our own driveway, but it was not as good and our driveway was not as wide and long as his. So we decided to play over there, and as we were playing basketball on his driveway, I decided that I was going to practice my one-handed half-court shots. Not that I've ever actually had to make one of those in a game, but I thought it would be fun to see, could I stand about 40 feet away from the basket and grab the ball with one arm and throw it and make it into the basket. So I did that, threw the ball, and unfortunately, I got nowhere near the basket. The ball went underneath the basket by several feet, at which point it sailed into the window of his garage door, shattered the window, and went right through into his garage. For a moment, I thought about running away. But we decided the right thing to do was to go to the door and confess what we had done. Not to mention, I knew my dad was going to find out about it anyway, so there was no escape. So we went around to his front door, knocked on the door, told him, hey, we're so sorry we broke your window. Whatever you need us to do, we'll pay for it. I apologize. We were out there without permission, the whole deal. And he goes, okay, come with me. So we go around back to the back of the house to where the garage is and the shattered window. He opens the garage door, walks into his garage where he has a stack of window panes. He also had teenage sons. He grabs one of them, closes the garage, clears out the glass, removes the frame, screws it back in, and goes all set and goes back in the house. We didn't have to pay for it. There was no lecture. I don't even think he told my parents. I don't really remember. But I remember that event so clearly because what I expected was punishment. And instead, I received mercy. I expected an angry lecture, and I got somebody who was perfectly calm, who was able to fix the problem just like that. We expected to have to pay for it, but he incurred the cost himself. As we have looked at the book of Romans, beginning last week, you'll remember we said that the book of Romans is Paul's treatise on the good news of the gospel. And he spends pretty much the first 11 chapters of the book of Romans explaining that you and I received mercy from God, grace from God, when what we deserved was punishment. And so Paul in the book of Romans explains, how is that possible? How is it possible for God to incur the cost of our sin and then forgive us? How is it possible that when we expected anger and wrath from God, what we got was love and grace and kindness and mercy? So that the essence of the book of Romans is that the gospel, again, a word that means good news, the gospel is not only good news, but it's the very best news in the universe. Because sinful men and women like you and me, who deserve death, who deserve eternal separation from God, have been given mercy and grace instead. As we continue into the book of Romans this week, though, as we get to the second half of chapter 1, Paul is going to help us understand, though, that before we can fully rejoice in the good news of the gospel and really even fully understand the magnitude of God's grace, we really have to understand how badly the glass was broken. All right? Because in order for us to be able to rejoice fully and stand fully how deeply God's grace runs, we have to first understand how deeply our sin runs. So that for the next several weeks, as we go through Romans 1 through 3, Paul's going to take us on kind of a dark journey into the heart of our sin and rebellion against God. And what we're going to see as we begin to move toward the magnitude of God's grace is that God is gracious even though we didn't deserve his grace. We're going to see sin is a really big deal. Sin is a really big deal. that you and I and all of humanity, through our disobedience to God, our refusal to worship him as our creator and our Lord, our refusal to obey his design for our lives, all of us have incurred his wrath and his judgment. And yet God in Jesus Christ has offered us good news, that there's forgiveness and hope through what Jesus has done. But again, in order to understand the magnitude of God's grace, we have to understand the depth of our own sin. We have to see that the glass is broken, and only God can pay the cost to fix it, and he has in Jesus Christ. This is where Romans 1, verses 18 to 32 is going to take us this morning. The gospel is good news because without it, we face the wrath of God. Without the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, without exercising faith in what he has done, all of us stand to face the wrath, the anger of God, not only now, but for eternity. But my hope is that the good news will be even brighter when we see the darkness of our sin. And I want to ask, do you and I really understand how serious sin is? That sin is not simply a mistake. It's not like tripping down the stairs and you go, oh no, I rebelled against God. But it's a serious deal that we've intentionally and deliberately violated God's designs. And we need the grace of God to get back to God. That's where Romans 1 is going to take us. And my prayer is that this will lead us into deeper worship and appreciation of all that God has done for us in Jesus Christ. So follow with me. I'm going to start in chapter 1, verse 18. I'm just going to read the first half of verse 18 to begin. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. So let me stop right there. The first thing that Paul tells us right in this section is he goes, our sin makes God angry. Angry. We're going to talk about this. This is what the word wrath means. It's God's anger. And I'm going to define this a little bit more tightly in a minute. Now, why do I say our sin? Because Paul here says the wrath of God is revealed against from heaven against what? All ungodliness and all unrighteousness of men. In other words, it's not just a few people who have sinned. It's not just a few cultures that have sinned. It's not just certain methods and modes of sinners. It's all sinners. You, me, everybody who has ever walked planet Earth has sinned against God and therefore incurred the wrath of God. He uses two words here, ungodliness and unrighteousness. This word ungodliness, he will talk about more in a moment in some of these verses. Basically, it is the idea that I don't accept God's rule and God's reign in my life. Maybe I don't even accept that God exists, but I deny the power and the deity of God. Unrighteousness is a word, if you remember from last week, we talked about how righteousness is this concept that I have met my obligations to God. Morally, ethically, spiritually, whatever, that I've met all of my relational obligations to God. That's righteousness. Unrighteousness would be a failure to do that. All right, so putting it all together, he says God's wrath, God's anger has come upon every single person and all of humanity because of our failure to acknowledge God, to obey God, and to fulfill our obligations to God. That's what's going on. We all deserve the wrath of God. Now, what is the wrath of God? The wrath of God, it's a word that very simply, it means anger. It means anger, but it's not the type of anger that is simply like emotional frustration or annoyance or irritation. But instead, the wrath of God is God's anger against sin that results in punishment, that results in judgment. In other words, the wrath of God is active. Let me show you this in a different context from a different verse, the concept of wrath and what wrath does. So Romans 13, we'll look at this later next semester in more detail. Paul says, but if you do what is evil, be afraid, for the government does not bear the sword for nothing, for it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. So think about the analogy for a minute. If you break the law, the odds are you're not just going to get a stern lecture from law enforcement. Now, I have before, if I'm speeding a little bit or something, I've been pulled over and they give me a stern lecture and they send me away with a warning. But most of the time, especially if you break the law in a more egregious way, you steal something, you kill somebody, you hit someone with a baseball bat, whatever it may be, you're going to experience not only the anger of the government, but you'll have to pay a fine, you might go to jail. In severe cases, you might be put to death. In other words, this wrath involves judgment. It involves punishment. So is the wrath of God. It's not passive, but it is active. In other places in the scripture, Paul talks about the future wrath of God. That is the wrath that is coming in the future, either after death or when Jesus returns, for those who have not believed in Jesus and have disobeyed God. So Colossians chapter 3, therefore consider the members of your earthly body as dead to immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and greed, which amounts to idolatry. For it is because of these things that the wrath of God will come upon the sons of disobedience. In other words, the wrath of God will come in the future. Now, here's what's important. Here in Romans 1, Paul says the wrath of God is revealed presently in the world against all ungodliness and unrighteousness. In other words, Paul's gonna trace this out for us for the rest of the passage, that God's wrath is currently being revealed in the way that the world, as the world pursues sin and rebellion and folly and all of this defiance of God, as the world goes this direction, God's wrath is being revealed as he no longer protects mankind from the consequences of sin in the here and now, but in fact hands us over. And Paul will use this phrase 3 times in Romans 1. He handed them over to the consequences of their sin. The wrath of God is currently being revealed in the fact that our hearts, our minds, our bodies, our society, our relationships, our marriages, our families, our workplaces, our neighborhoods are shot through with sin and broken and falling apart all over the place. The wrath of God is being revealed. Now, this is not the most pleasant biblical concept, right? The wrath of God. And so for a lot of us, we're uncomfortable with this because we're only familiar with the anger of people, the wrath of human beings that tends to be arbitrary and tends to be unjust and unequally applied. So most of us can think of an authority figure in our lives who was angry, but angry randomly and unfairly. Maybe, sadly, you had a parent like that. You never knew when they were going to get mad. You never knew what was going to set them off. You never knew when they were going to punish you or for what, or if they would punish you more severely than your sibling who did the same thing. I had a teacher like this whom I vividly remember from 7th grade. Her anger was arbitrary and severe and random, and she would hone in on certain students, even if they were doing the same things other students were doing at the same time. I remember I had one classmate named Tommy who sat next to me in this class, and it got to where every single day, all he had to do was just kind of turn his head the wrong direction or just barely look at this teacher wrong, and she would send him out into the hall. I remember him coming into class multiple times and saying, I think I'm going to just go ahead and move my desk into the hall because I know that's where I'm going to end up. He never knew when. He never was fully sure of why. I remember one time I sat next to him and he did something wrong. She sent him into the hall and then she looked at me and she goes, Matt Morton, I used to think you were such a kind-hearted, sweet young man, and now I know better. And I remember thinking, I'm just sitting next to the guy. I'm just in the vicinity. But your anger is arbitrary, unfair, unequal, and unjust. What Paul is going to trace out through the rest of Romans 1, God's wrath is not like the anger of mankind. It is righteous and just, and it is equally applied across all of humanity because all of humanity has failed to meet our God's standards. Our relational obligations to God. All of humanity is steeped in unrighteousness. So he says our sin makes God angry. And then he's going to go on and he says, we have no excuse. We have no excuse. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, sin isn't an accident A lot of times it feels that way to us. I didn't know, I didn't mean to. It's not an accident. Rebellion against God is deliberate and planned. I'm going to finish verse 18 and go through verse 20. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Because that which is known about God is evident within, or evident among them, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. So here's where he goes. He says, ever since God created the world, created the universe, he has been revealing himself clearly to men and women. So that when we look at creation, when we look at the world, when we look at ourselves, our minds, our bodies, the fact that we are rational, moral, spiritual beings, the idea is God is constantly calling out to say, look at who I am. That there is a God who sits on the throne of the universe. His deity, his godness is clearly seen in the reality of creation itself and his eternal power. The idea that going back from eternity past, God is in control. God is sovereign. So the idea that Paul is getting at is that all of humanity ought to be able to look around and say, there is a God who made the universe, who rules the universe. But instead, what have we done? Suppressed the truth, pretended he's not real, ignored him, denied our own responsibility before him, and acted in unrighteousness against him. What Paul says is all the signs are there, and we've chosen to cover them up, not look at them, pretend they don't exist. So Paul's going to trace this argument that the consequences of sin and the wrath of God is something that is coming upon all unrighteousness, and nobody will be able to stand before God and say, wait, I didn't know. I didn't have enough information. I wish you told me. Paul is hearkening back to passages like Psalm 19 that talk about how the heavens are telling of the glory of God. And then even toward the end of that psalm, talks about how our hearts relate to God morally and spiritually. The idea is that creation and even our own conscience and even our own design testifies to God. So that when the wrath of God arrives, we cannot say, I didn't know this would come if I ignored, suppressed, or denied God. Think about it like a warning light on the dashboard of your car. This is a true story. About a month ago, I was driving from Dallas back to College Station. And I was on I-45 and I was going about 75 miles an hour when all of a sudden my car began to wildly fishtail in its lane and I couldn't control it and it was swerving back and forth. I knew immediately what had happened. Not only because it had happened to me before, but because for the last month before that, that little tire light on my dash had been on. And I had checked the pressure, but I thought, it's probably okay. It's probably not a big deal. But apparently there had been a slow pressure leak that light was picking up that I wanted to deny existed because tires are like $800 a piece. And so I continued driving and found myself in this dangerous situation. Now, fortunately, I was able to maneuver to the side of the road, get the tire fixed, get the tire repaired, get back on the road. But it could have been life or death. And if it had been life or death, I would have to acknowledge I was at fault. I ignored the sign. I ignored the warning. Paul says all of humankind has ignored God's signs, rejected God's truth, suppressed it because we want to reign over our own lives and over creation and over everything ourselves. We want to be God. We don't want God. And so he says, everybody has the information that they need to lead them toward the knowledge of God. Now, this also helps us answer a question that often comes up, that people ask me a lot. Well, what about the person who lives, say, in tribal Africa or South America and has never heard about Jesus? There's no churches or anything around. How can that person be held accountable before God on the day of judgment? Well, the answer is that as God reveals truth, every single person chooses to respond positively or negatively, to accept or reject the truth God has revealed. And what we see in Scripture, and I think this is validated also in many, many, many stories that I've heard in the present day, is that a person who responds positively to God's revelation that they do see, that person almost invariably, in fact, I would say invariably, receives more revelation and more revelation and more revelation that leads them to the truth of Jesus Christ. You see it in the book of Acts with this Gentile man, Cornelius, who is truly seeking God. And God sends Peter to him to preach the gospel. Or the Ethiopian royal official who's reading the scroll of Isaiah, and he wants to understand it because he wants to know God. And God miraculously transports Philip to run alongside his chariot to tell him about Jesus. I've heard many stories in the present day of men and women born in societies far from God, where the gospel hasn't yet penetrated, but as they ask questions about what they've heard and what they've been taught, and they look at the world and they say, there has to be a God who made this. Often people have visions, dreams, or they hear from missionaries, or they find the Lord even online, that God gives more light to those who receive the light that they've been given. And yet we're going to see he will darken the minds of those who reject him, so that our sin has no excuse. Our sin has no excuse. So the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. Sin makes God angry. Sin has no excuse. And thirdly, here's what we're going to see is from here, sin begins to infect everything, every part of our lives. From our minds to our hearts, to our bodies, to our desires, every part of our lives. So follow with me. I'm going to begin by reading verses 21 to 25, and then I'll make a few comments before we get into verses 26 and 27. For even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Actually, let me stop here for just a moment. So he says, look, it's not just that everybody should know about God, it's that everybody on some level does know about God, and yet they suppress the truth. And he says, here's what happens when we do that is as a result, they say, I'm not going to give thanks to the God who created heaven and earth. Instead, I'm going to begin to worship the creation or create idols or whatever it may be, but I'm not going to give thanks. I'm going to dig in, and instead of saying, God, thank you that I'm alive, that I exist, that the world exists, that you're good, that you're powerful, that you're loving, I'm going to dig in and deny him and refuse to give thanks. There's a great quote from the writer G.K. Chesterton. He says, the worst moment for an atheist is when he is really thankful and has no one to thank. And what's he getting at? The idea is simply this. There's something written in my heart that says somebody made this, gave this to me, placed me here. And Paul says, mankind has said, I don't want to give thanks. And here's where he goes. He says, what the result of that is that even our reasoning, our minds begin to be futile in their speculations. You can't rationalize your way out of the consequences of rejection of God. No PhD or post-grad seminar will save you from this one. Your mind is darkened by sin if you refuse to acknowledge and thank God. Because what happens is in your mind, you are denying what Paul says, hey, is clearly seen in all of creation. Your mind is darkened by sin. And he says their foolish heart was darkened as well. Biblically, the heart is the seat of the affections, the seat of what we love, what we care about. So he says it's not just that my mind is darkened, it's that the things I begin to love are not the things that God loves. I care about those things God doesn't care about, and I don't care about those things God does care about. So verse 22, going on, it says, professing to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man and of birds and four-footed animals and crawling creatures. Therefore, God gave them over. There's the first instance. God handed them over in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, so that their bodies would be dishonored among them. For they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. So he says, men and women who deny God, who run from God, and remember, this is all of humanity. They think they're wise, but they're fools. And here's what we tend to do then, is we try to find ultimate meaning in things that are not ultimate. So people build idols, and if you look at idolatrous religions often have idols for, prosperity, idols for fertility, idols for the crops to grow. They've got a different little god to cover every area of their lives to say, if I make gods that will give me what I want, then I can control the universe instead of submitting to God. And he says not only that, but we begin to worship people as well. We try to find ultimate meaning in the people around us instead of acknowledging that the people around us and we ourselves are invested with meaning and purpose from a God who made us to display and proclaim his glory. And so we say, I'm going to lean on you to offer me meaning. I ran across a very recent survey from the Pew Research Group, and they asked people, where do you find most of the meaning, the primary meaning in your life? And Americans, this may not surprise you, the biggest or the largest answer, 38%, was in my family, Now, in and of itself, you may go, hey, family is great. We should care about family. We should love our families. But I want you to think what happens when I begin to look to my wife or my children or my parents for ultimate meaning. I begin to lean upon them as an object of my worship rather than to love them from an overflow of the love and the meaning and the purpose God has placed in my life. What happens is that my family and my kids, They are great family members, but they're really bad gods. And so think about it this way. If I came in here this morning and I have a bottle of water, right, a half-gallon bottle of water, and you come up to me and you have an empty bottle of water and you say, hey, I forgot to fill mine this morning. Can you fill mine with some of yours? I go, sure. So I pour some of mine into your bottle. You drink yours, I drink some of mine, and then you go, hey, I need you to fill my bottle some more. So I fill it some more. You drink yours, you drink mine. It's not going to take very long before mine is empty and yours is empty. And you say, fill mine up even more, and I'm pouring from an empty bottle. That doesn't work, right? Now, if we take both of our bottles, though, and we stand under Niagara Falls, there is an infinite source of water. Right? Set aside the fact that we'd be washed away and carried off somewhere, right? There's an infinite source of water to fill those cups forever. And what Paul is saying is that God is the Niagara Falls of love and purpose and meaning and life. And yet we've gone to other people and to idols and said, I'd rather have my cup filled by somebody else with a half-empty cup. And he says what that results in is a mind that doesn't think straight, a heart that doesn't love right, distance between us and God, distance between us and others, disordered loves and desires. So he goes on in verses 26 to 27, and he says, for this reason, God gave them over. Here's that phrase again. God gave them over to degrading passions. For their women exchanged the natural function for that which is unnatural. And in the same way also the men abandoned the natural function of the woman and burned in their desire toward one another, men with men committing indecent acts and receiving in their own persons the due penalty of their error. All right, so let me pause. I realize these are some challenging passages right here, a couple of difficult verses. It is clear that in the context, Paul is talking about homosexual behavior, homosexual actions. And so I want to talk about this for a couple of minutes, and I'm going to answer a couple of questions. But let me start by saying this. In the context of this passage, I don't have time this morning to fully answer every question you may have about this topic. And I realize this is a sensitive topic. It's a sensitive topic in our culture. For some of you, it's a sensitive topic personally. And for some of you, I know it's a sensitive topic within your family. So I want to be able to address it fully. And so I say that all to say, in the spring, we're going to come back around to this topic more thoroughly. After Easter, we're going to do a 4 or 5 week series on what the Bible tells us on these subjects of gender and sexuality. However, in the meanwhile, let me talk about what Paul is saying here and why he's saying it in Romans chapter 1. Why does Paul talk about homosexuality in this particular context? It's not because Paul is trying to say this is like the worst possible sin or the culmination of this slide into depravity. In fact, we're going to see in the rest of the passage, Paul even takes us deeper and deeper and deeper into this slide into depravity. So that's not why he's addressing it here. He's addressing it here because it is an illustration in his mind, an example in his mind of the way in which humanity, mankind, has departed from God's creative intent. Let me say that again. His discussion of homosexual behavior here is here because it is an illustration of one way in which humanity has departed from God's creative intent. That we are designed to worship God, to honor God with our minds, our hearts, and our bodies, and in almost every single way. With the way we treat people, with what we say, with what we think, with how we reason, and yes, with how we use our sexuality given to us by God, we have chosen to deviate, to depart from God's creative design. If you were with us in the book of Proverbs, when I talked about what the Proverbs says about sex and sexuality, you'll remember that we went back to Genesis chapter 2, where we saw a passage that Jesus also quotes that lays out God's creative design for male and female and for sexuality and marriage, right? So you remember, it says, the Lord God fashioned into a woman the rib which he had taken from the man and brought her to the man. The man said, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. In other words, she's like him, but she's different from him. There's creativity and complementarity. They fit together, but they aren't exactly the same. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh, or they will make a new family. They will leave their families of origin. They will join together in a relationship that is spiritually, emotionally, personally, and yes, sexually intimate. And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. So Paul, in his mind, here in Romans chapter 1, is almost certainly thinking back to Genesis 2. And he says, as mankind has denied our Creator, denied his power, denied his design, we have drifted from his creative design, and the way we express our sexuality is a part of that. Now, I will say there are some that read this passage, and others like it, in the New Testament, and they say, well, Paul is only really talking here about kind of sexual promiscuity when it comes to homosexuality, or ritual child abuse that was practiced in the ancient world, that Paul didn't really know about what we would call like gay marriage today, or loving monogamous sexual relationships, homosexual relationships. The challenge with that viewpoint is, first of all, he mentions both females and males. So most of the promiscuity and ritual child abuse in the ancient world was male. In fact, almost all of it. Amongst females, certainly there was known what we would call gay marriage, even in the ancient world. It was even known amongst males. And Paul is very, very broad here in his discussion of homosexual behavior. Okay, so I don't think we can get out of this by saying he's only rejecting certain forms or kinds of homosexual behavior. I do think that this is a blanket type of rejection. But again, we have to remember the context. The context here is this is a rejection of God's creative design. Now, one of the other questions that comes up is you go, well, why doesn't Paul talk about heterosexual lust and sexuality and adultery? He does. Wait until we get to chapter 2. Okay, the other thing that comes up is, well, what about those self-righteous, hypocritical people who sit up on a pedestal and they look down at those who struggle with sexual sin and they say, I'm glad that's not me because God approves of me because I'm clean and I'm well-spoken and I don't do those things. What about that guy? If that's you, he's coming for you in chapter 2. Just wait a minute. All right, because Paul's point is all of our rejection of God as the creator, God as the ruler, God as the supreme over all the universe. It's unrighteous, sinful, and it leads to devastation and death and separation from God. And so he says our sin infects every part of us. All right, and then he's going to go on and he's going to say because of that, our sin knows no limits. It begins to move outward from the individual into our relationships with others, even into society and culture itself. Follow with me, verse 28. And just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God any longer, God gave them over, there it is again, to a depraved mind, to do those things which are not proper, being filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, evil, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, without understanding, untrustworthy, unloving, unmerciful. And although they know the ordinance of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death, they not only do the same, but also give hearty approval to those who practice them. So now Paul paints a picture of how God gives humanity over one more time, and there's a litany of sin. Relational sin, sin as it relates to our money, sin as it relates to other people, sin as it relates to what we say, right? And what's fascinating about this is what Paul seems to be getting at is once we've rejected God and we've tried to cast off the chains, everything else falls apart. And what is amazing about this, you read that list, you're like, some of those sins look really, really bad. I think we all would be like, murder, yeah, that's a bad one, that's a biggie. But then he has other things like gossip, and you're like, oh no, right? Or disobedient to parents. It's like Paul goes, here's something for the children, right? I want to throw this in as well. And so with this sweeping list of sins, he says all of humanity now stands under the condemnation and the wrath of God. And so God gave them over. And so just as in the previous passage, he had said that those who depart from God's design with their bodies, he says they receive in themselves the penalty of their error. The idea here is simply that the enslavement to sin is in itself an expression of the wrath of God. Here it is, God hands us over to relationships that aren't right, a society that isn't right, filled with violence and greed and mistrust, and eventually people lose compassion for other people, and our word can't be trusted, and everything falls downhill. And at the end of it, he says, and the worst of it is not only that they do these things, but they give hearty approval to those who practice them. In other words, they go beyond simply sinning in a moment of pressure. It's beyond, I'm going to steal a loaf of bread because I'm hungry. Instead, there's a carefully crafted justification for the sin. And when somebody else violates God's standards, we end up with a culture that goes, bravo, well done, keep it up. So that there is an intentional desire to cast off the authority of God. This has happened in our culture, and this has happened in the world. Several years ago, I found myself in an argument on Facebook, something I do not do anymore. But what happened was I had a friend from high school who posted that he was at an ice cream shop and he saw an employee of the ice cream shop take the money for a sale, and instead of ringing it up and putting it in the cash register, the employee just pocketed the money and moved on. And so he said, I reported that employee to the management and all of that. There was another person who got on, somebody I didn't know, who began to say, how dare you report them? You don't know that person's circumstances, and what does it really matter if they steal from some big corporation that doesn't pay them enough, and all of these justifications. And so people began to get on and go, yeah, but stealing is wrong, right? And they were like, nah, but it's not really, not always wrong, right? And the argument became from this person not only that the circumstances mitigate the punishment, right? That somebody who might steal in a moment of desperation might merit less punishment than somebody who does it craftily or something like that. But the argument was stealing isn't really wrong. And I remember having this discussion, this argument, and all of a sudden it occurred to me, I can't believe that I am debating with another rational human being whether it is wrong to take what isn't yours. That's a basic moral principle that you almost certainly taught your toddlers as soon as they could talk. Stealing is wrong. But what happens is when we drift from the authority of God and His Word, we begin to justify things that have no justification before God. So Paul says this is where we end in chapter 1. So you're like, where's the good news? Thanks a lot. Okay. Here's the good news. The good news is that God doesn't leave us there. And we're going to see that as we move toward chapter 3, chapter 4, chapter 5. Right? The good news is that despite the darkness and depravity of our sin, God has paved a way for restoration. Despite how badly and irreparably we have broken the glass, God fixes it through Jesus Christ. And so how do we respond here at the end of chapter 1? Let me offer a couple of thoughts. First of all, admit you're a sinner. Admit your sin. Acknowledge that before a holy God, it's not that everybody has done everything in this list of sins in Romans 1. That's not what Paul is saying. It's just that all of us have done at least some of them. And we have violated God's creative intent for our lives to honor and glorify Him. And so we have to acknowledge it. We stand every bit as much under the wrath of God as anybody else, even if they're not dressed as well, even if they're not as smooth, even if they're not as polite. Our hearts, apart from Jesus, are just as dark. Admit our sin and then give thanks. Give thanks for the grace of God. Honor Him as God and give thanks. Not only because of creation, not only because we're alive, but because in Jesus Christ, He set us free from death and sin. So we want to be people who give thanks.